You may imagine that history was defined by battles, kings, and monumental discoveries. But for most people, daily life was defined by what they ate, and often that food was not what you would expect. Across centuries and continents, diets were shaped by scarcity, necessity, tradition, and imagination. Many of the dishes that appeared on tables in the past would strike us today as unsettling, odd, or even repulsive. Yet, to those who ate them, they were simply survival, or, in some cases, delicacies worth celebrating. To begin understanding this strange culinary history, you must place yourself in a world without refrigeration, without global trade networks, without industrial preservation. Every scrap of food carried immense value, and waste was considered foolish or sinful. People ate what could be caught, gathered, raised, or stored, and that often meant consuming parts of animals or plants that modern kitchens discard. Strange foods were not a novelty. They were woven into ordinary existence. In medieval Europe, for example, the idea of wasting any part of an animal was unthinkable. A pig was not only a source of meat, but also fat for candles, bristles for brushes, and bones for broth. Every organ had a purpose at the table. Dishes were devised for lungs, stomachs, intestines, and brains. Offal was not poor man's food alone. Nobles enjoyed elaborately spiced preparations of liver or kidneys, believing these flavors demonstrated wealth through imported seasonings. A banquet might offer a guest stuffed sheep's stomach, heavily seasoned and boiled, not because it was fashionable, but because it was normal. The strange foods of the past were often born of hunger. In times of famine, desperation drove people to consume what they might otherwise avoid. Historical records tell of peasants grinding bark into flour to bake bread when harvests failed. They boiled nettles, acorns, or even leather scraps softened in water. During harsh winters in northern Europe, soup might be stretched with moss or lichen. In China, famine-era survival sometimes meant eating soil mixed with roots, shaped into cakes. These were not cultural delicacies but acts of endurance. They illustrate how closely food and survival were bound, and how necessity erased the line between edible and inedible. Yet not all strange foods arose from desperation. Some became cultural symbols of abundance, health, or luxury. Romans famously enjoyed delicacies such as stuffed dormice, roasted and flavored with honey and poppy seeds. These tiny animals were specially fattened in clay jars before being served at feasts. What might seem unthinkable to us was, to them, an impressive display of refinement. Roman cuisine also featured garum, a fermented fish sauce made from rotting fish guts left to steep in the sun. The powerful odor was infamous, but it flavored countless dishes, spreading across the empire as a staple seasoning. To Roman palates, garum was what soy sauce or ketchup is to ours. Ordinary, beloved, indispensable. Medieval banquets also delighted in foods designed to astonish. Peacock, served roasted with its feathers reattached, impressed guests more than it satisfied hunger. Swans were prepared for feast days, their flesh considered noble, though by many accounts unpleasantly tough. Nobility sometimes demanded elaborate pies where live birds were hidden inside, flying out when the crust was cut, more spectacle than nourishment. These strange presentations remind us that food was not only about sustenance but also performance, power, and the reinforcement of social hierarchies. In Asia, traditions created their own unique flavors. In Korea, fermented skate, a type of fish that releases ammonia as it ages, became a prized dish. Its pungent odor and sharp taste still challenge modern diners, but historically it was valued as a food that could be preserved without refrigeration. In China, century eggs, duck or chicken eggs preserved in clay, ash, and salt until the yolks turned green and the whites dark and translucent, were enjoyed for their creamy texture and strong aroma. These were not accidental creations but deliberate arts of preservation, transforming food through patience and fermentation into dishes that carried prestige. Insects, too, have been part of human diets across time. Grasshoppers, crickets, and locusts provided protein in regions where livestock was scarce. Biblical accounts describe locusts as food for prophets, and archaeological evidence shows their consumption across Africa and the Middle East. In Mesoamerica, ants, worms, and beetles were eaten roasted, ground, or mixed into sauces. For many cultures, insects were not strange at all. They were practical, nourishing, and flavorful. Only in modern Western context did insect consumption become stigmatized, seen as strange rather than sensible. Even drinks had their share of unusual ingredients. In medieval Europe, ale was sometimes thickened with bread or flavored with herbs like ground ivy or yarrow before hops became common. In the Andes, chicha beer was brewed by women who chewed maize, spitting it into pots to begin fermentation with enzymes from their saliva. To participants, this was tradition, ritual, and community. To outsiders, it might appear shocking. But every culture normalizes its own methods, and what seems strange across distance or time is often ordinary when lived. Cheese, today a global comfort, was once a product of mystery. Its earliest makers could not fully explain why curdling transformed milk into something edible. The strong, sometimes overwhelming odors of aged cheeses were embraced rather than shunned. Medieval travelers often complained of stinking cheeses that were nonetheless prized in local markets. To eat such foods required trust in tradition rather than scientific understanding, a willingness to believe that what smelled foul could still nourish. Consider also the way preservation influenced taste. Before refrigeration, food was salted, smoked, pickled, or dried. Fish traveled inland packed in barrels of salt, meat was smoked until hard, vegetables were brined until sour. These processes created flavors radically different from fresh foods, often much stronger, more pungent, or more bitter. Generations grew accustomed to tastes shaped by necessity, to the point where they became cultural preferences. What modern palates might reject as spoiled or extreme was, in the past, simply the taste of survival. Strange foods reveal the profound adaptability of human beings. They remind us that eating is not only biological, but also cultural. What one society rejects, another prizes. What one era considers desperate, another elevates as tradition. Across history, these foods were testimonies to ingenuity, the ability to transform scarcity into sustenance, to turn the ordinary into ritual, to embrace flavors born of necessity as part of identity. As you picture these meals, roasted dormice, bark bread, fermented fish sauce, or moss soup, you might ask yourself, do these dishes tell us more about the past? Or do they reveal something about ourselves? For if necessity shaped what people ate then, is it not possible that future generations may find our own diets just as strange? When you step further into the kitchens, marketplaces, and banquet halls of the past, the strangeness of ancient diets becomes even more vivid. Food was never only about hunger, it was about culture, medicine, and sometimes even superstition. What people chose to eat, or felt compelled to eat, was often tied to beliefs about health, spirituality, and survival, far beyond taste alone. Consider the medieval conviction that food could shape the balance of the body's humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Physicians believed that eating certain foods could correct or disrupt these delicate balances. This belief led to unusual choices at the table. Beaver tails, rich in fat, were considered acceptable to eat during fasting periods because church authorities classified beavers as fish, since they lived partly in water. Frogs, turtles, and even certain birds were grouped the same way, blurring the boundaries of categories that we take for granted today. A monk might chew on roasted beaver tail while considering himself obedient to his vows of abstinence. The strange foods of the past were often eaten with deep reverence for their supposed healing power. In Renaissance Europe, powdered mummy, a substance ground from embalmed bodies brought from Egypt, was sold as medicine, believed to cure everything from headaches to stomach ailments. People consumed small amounts mixed into drinks, convinced they were ingesting ancient vitality. To us, it seems horrific, but to them it was a curious blend of science, commerce, and faith. Apothecaries profited, patients believed, and so the practice persisted for centuries. Even within ordinary households, odd ingredients shaped daily meals. In the Scottish Highlands, where grain was precious, blood pudding became a staple. Animal blood was mixed with oats, fat, and seasoning, boiled until solid, and served as sustenance for hard-working families. To modern palates, it may seem unappealing, yet it was nourishing, efficient, and waste-free. In Iceland, hakkarl, or fermented shark, was buried underground for months until the toxic flesh became edible. Its sharp, ammonia-heavy taste is still considered challenging today, but to generations past, it was proof of resilience in a harsh landscape. In Japan, foods once seen as strange became beloved cultural treasures. Natto, fermented soybeans with a sticky texture and pungent smell, was embraced not only for its nutrition but also for its role in tradition. To outsiders, the slimy strands might seem unpalatable, but to those who grew up with it, natto was both comfort and heritage. Similarly, in Mongolia, fermented mare's milk, known as aerog, was essential to nomadic life, celebrated in gatherings and rituals. These drinks and dishes were not curiosities. They were central threads of identity. What appears strange also depends on perspective. To medieval Europeans, spices like cinnamon and nutmeg were extraordinary luxuries, so expensive that they were often displayed as status symbols rather than consumed. A kitchen filled with cloves or saffron signaled wealth beyond measure. Yet, to the people of the Spice Islands, these ingredients were ordinary harvests of their land. The strangeness was in the economics, not the flavor. What was exotic to one culture was routine to another. Travelers' accounts often captured the shock of encountering foreign foods. When European explorers first arrived in the Americas, they were baffled by maize, cacao, and chili peppers. They struggled to understand how indigenous peoples could drink cacao mixed with water and chili, unsweetened and bitter. To them, it was unpleasant. To the locals, it was sacred. The irony, of course, is that chocolate would later become one of the most beloved flavors worldwide, transformed by sugar and milk into something entirely new. What was once dismissed as strange became irresistible. Similarly, the potato was met with suspicion when introduced to Europe. Some believed it caused leprosy, others thought it was unfit for human consumption. Only through centuries of adaptation did it become a staple crop, now considered comfort food. The tomato, too, was once feared as poisonous. Imagine the strangeness of seeing a bright red fruit and believing it could kill, only for it later to define entire cuisines. Animals themselves carried strange associations. In times of hardship, people ate what was available, and that often included creatures we would not consider food today. Cats and dogs were consumed during sieges and famines in Europe. Hedgehogs were baked in clay to remove their spines, eaten as practical meals. In parts of France, snails were not only eaten but cultivated, considered delicate and valuable. Cultural acceptance transformed what others might see as strange into normality. In South America, guinea pigs, known as Q, have been a traditional food for centuries. Raised in households, they were roasted or stewed during festivals. To outsiders, the idea might seem odd, but within Andean culture, it was both nourishing and celebratory. The strangeness is only in the eye of the beholder, and when you reflect on it, every culture has its version of strange. The history of sweets also reveals curious tastes. In medieval Europe, desserts were often spiced with pepper, saffron, or vinegar, producing flavors far from the sugary treats we expect. Jellies were made with meat stock, tinted with herbs, and sweetened with honey, a fusion of savory and sweet that confuses modern definitions. Sugar itself was once a rare medicine, sold by apothecaries before it became a kitchen staple. To chew on candied fennel seeds or rose petals was as fashionable as eating cake today. Every example of strange food from the past reflects ingenuity. Humans pushed the boundaries of what was edible, finding ways to survive, to celebrate, to heal, and to impress. To us, the thought of eating powdered mummy, fermented shark, or roasted dormice feels unsettling. But perhaps the deeper lesson is humility. We are products of our own time, confident in our definitions of normal, yet history shows how fluid that category is. As you consider these meals, blood puddings, natto, mummy dust, guinea pig roasts, another question rises quietly. If future generations look back at our diets, at processed snacks, synthetic additives, and factory-farmed meats, what will they think? Will they see abundance and choice, or will they see strangeness and folly? The more you move through the record of food history, the clearer it becomes that strangeness is never fixed. What one century considered nourishment, another considered poison. What one culture saw as ordinary, another viewed with revulsion. The dining table becomes not just a place of meals, but a mirror of beliefs, fears, and ambitions. Take, for example, the Roman Empire. In its height, wealthy Romans ate things that today would startle even the most adventurous diner. Flamingo tongues, served as delicacies at elite banquets, were praised for their texture and rarity. Dormice were fattened in special terracotta jars called gliraria, then roasted or stuffed with nuts and honey. These were not mere novelties. They signaled status and control over abundance. To invite guests to eat such things was to demonstrate power, both economic and cultural. Yet not all strange foods were for luxury. Many were born of desperation. In rural medieval villages, famine was always near. People foraged for whatever could be chewed, from nettles boiled into thin soup to bark stripped from trees and ground into flour. Acorns, usually bitter and inedible, were leached of tannins with water and made into bread. In Eastern Europe, lichen was sometimes boiled into a jelly-like meal during harsh winters. These foods may not have been pleasant, but they sustained life. They carried dignity in survival. Sometimes the strangeness lay not in the food itself, but in its preparation. In Renaissance Italy, cooks experimented with dishes designed to surprise and entertain. A pie might be baked with live birds sealed inside, so that when cut open at the table they would fly out, astonishing the guests. This practice, which later inspired nursery rhymes, was a theatrical way to show wealth and creativity. Another recipe described serving an entire roast peacock redressed in its preserved feathers, as if it were alive again. For diners, the sight was as important as the taste. Other strangeness arose from the blending of medicine and meals. In ancient China, some foods were chosen not for their flavor but for their supposed ability to balance qi, the vital energy of the body. Dried seahorses were powdered and consumed as medicine. Turtle shells were boiled into broths thought to restore strength. In Europe, similar reasoning guided diets. Eels were recommended for certain ailments, while animal organs were consumed with the belief that they would strengthen the corresponding part of the human body. Eating the heart of a strong animal was thought to improve courage. Eating the brain might sharpen wit. Food taboos added another layer of complexity. In India, cows were sacred and thus avoided as food, while in other regions, beef became central. In Jewish and Islamic traditions, pork was forbidden, shaping entire cuisines around absence as much as presence. To outsiders, these rules might have seemed restrictive, but within the cultures they were pillars of identity. The strangeness was not in the foods themselves, but in the boundaries drawn between what was permitted and what was not. Fermentation, one of the oldest methods of preservation, produced flavors and textures that some loved and others shunned. In Northern Europe, fish were buried in the ground to ferment into dishes like surströmming in Sweden, notorious today for its powerful odor. In Korea, kimchi became a beloved national dish, yet early European visitors often wrote with shock about its pungency. The idea of rotting vegetables or fish transforming into food was, to many, a difficult one. But without fermentation, survival through long winters would have been impossible. Travel literature abounds with bewildered descriptions of food. When Arab travelers encountered Viking feasts, they described barrels of beer and plates of dried fish with a mix of fascination and distaste. When Chinese envoys visited Central Asia, they recorded with surprise the drinking of fermented horse milk. Europeans arriving in Asia recoiled at dishes like bird's nest soup, made from the saliva of swiftlets, which to locals was a prized delicacy. Each reaction reminds us that what is familiar to one person is shocking to another. Even sweets, which seem universal, carried strange forms. In Elizabethan England, sugar sculptures called subtleties were carved into elaborate shapes, castles, animals, even famous people, and displayed during feasts. Guests admired them before breaking pieces off to eat. In Venice, candied rose petals and pine nuts were fashionable, while in the Ottoman Empire, thick syrups of fruit and honey were consumed in large quantities. To someone from a modern world of chocolate bars and soft drinks, the flavors and textures would feel oddly medicinal, less like desserts and more like remedies. Animals considered inedible in one culture became staples in another. Grasshoppers and locusts, often seen as pests, were roasted and eaten across Africa and the Middle East. They provided vital protein and were praised in religious texts. In contrast, Europeans avoided them, writing instead of disgust. Yet today, as sustainability becomes a concern, insect-based foods are again gaining attention. The strangeness circles back, transformed by necessity and perspective. What ties all of these stories together is adaptability. Humans across time found ways to turn the environment into sustenance, whether through creativity, ritual, or survival. Strange foods reflect not only curiosity but resilience. The past is full of flavors we may never taste, yet each tells us about the people who dared to try them. And now, as you think about those tables, Roman feasts with flamingo tongues, Viking camps with dried fish, Andean homes with roasted guinea pigs, you may wonder what flavors from our present will seem just as strange to the people of the distant future. When you look across centuries of human eating, one pattern repeats with almost predictable rhythm. The line between food and medicine is blurred. What seems unusual to us today was once a cure, a ritual, or a promise of vitality. People did not eat simply for taste or hunger. They ate to heal, to protect, and to influence the unseen forces of health and spirit. In medieval Europe, bread was not only a staple, but sometimes a treatment. Special loaves were baked with herbs such as sage or rosemary and given to the sick. Pilgrims returned from holy sites carrying blessed bread, believed to ward off fevers. At the same time, some households baked bread with powdered ground bones or ashes, under the conviction that the essence of the dead could strengthen the living. To modern ears, it feels unsettling, but in those times, death and life intertwined at every table. In China, exotic ingredients entered kitchens with equal parts reverence and caution. Shark fins, deer antlers, and ginseng roots were prized not for their taste alone, but for their alleged power to restore balance to the body. Dried lizards were hung in apothecaries and steeped into broths. A tonic made of sea cucumbers was swallowed for stamina. Each bite or sip was not just a meal. It was a step toward harmony, health, or longevity. The Aztec world also offers remarkable glimpses. They consumed amaranth mixed with honey in ritual offerings, shaping the mixture into figurines of gods before breaking them apart and eating them. This was not just nourishment but communion. The body of the deity became part of the body of the eater. It was both food and sacrament. Alongside these rituals, insects such as ants, grasshoppers, and even water bugs were fried, ground, and stirred into sauces. Protein was scarce, so every buzzing or crawling creature represented survival. What was strange to one culture was practical genius to another. Europe, too, had its quirks with protein. In monasteries, where the rules of fasting forbade meat on many days, loopholes were found. Beavers, whose tails were covered in scaly skin, were classified as fish, allowing monks to dine on them during Lent. Likewise, puffins and other seabirds were grouped under the same category. This blending of theology and diet made possible meals that appear strange in hindsight, but were perfectly logical in their moment. Elsewhere, preservation produced unexpected flavors. In Iceland, hakarl, or fermented shark, became notorious. Sharks contain toxic compounds in their fresh flesh, but by burying the meat for months and letting it ferment, the toxins broke down. The result was a pungent food that saved lives during winters when little else was available. What outsiders today might call repulsive was, to those who depended on it, proof of resilience. If we step into the kitchens of Renaissance courts, we encounter extravagance disguised as dining. Sweetmeats colored with ground minerals shimmered like jewels. Jellies quivered in unnatural hues, dyed with saffron or cochineal insects. Entire animals were cooked, stuffed, and presented in deceptive ways. Fish inside poultry, poultry inside pigs, pigs inside cows. Layers of surprise for astonished guests. These dishes were not about flavor. They were theater, social commentary, and power. But while elites staged spectacles, the poor often survived on strange improvisations. In times of famine, grass and roots became stews. During sieges, such as the infamous one at Paris in 1870, desperate citizens ate horses, dogs, cats, and even rats sold openly in butchers' stalls. In some places, zoo animals were slaughtered for food. These meals were not chosen, but forced, and each bite carried the taste of survival more than satisfaction. The mingling of disgust and necessity appears often in food history. In Japan, natto fermented soybeans became a staple for its protein and health benefits. Its sticky texture and pungent smell made it a difficult dish for outsiders, yet locals valued it deeply. In France, strong cheeses aged until veined with mold were praised for flavor but horrified foreign travelers. Strangeness was never inherent in the food itself. It was created in the mind of the observer. Even drinks carried strange legacies. In the Americas, chicha, a fermented corn beverage, was sometimes prepared by chewing the kernels first, then spitting them into a communal vessel to ferment. The enzymes in saliva helped the process. To those within the culture, it was ordinary. To newcomers, it was shocking. Yet, in the end, the result was a nourishing drink that bound communities together. All of this raises a question. What is the measure of strangeness in food? Is it the ingredient, the method, the belief behind it, or simply the distance between our tastes and those of the past? And if we look closely, are the things we eat today really less strange? Or are we simply too accustomed to notice? When you step back and consider the broad sweep of history, food reveals itself as more than mere sustenance. It is a mirror of human imagination, shaped by fear, desire, belief, and necessity. What was consumed in past centuries often followed rules very different from the ones you follow today, and those choices can seem bewildering. Yet, if you listen closely, each dish has its logic. Consider the Romans, whose empire stretched across diverse lands. Their feasts included dormice, small rodents carefully fattened in jars, then roasted or stuffed with nuts and honey. To the Roman elite, this was refinement, a symbol of control over nature. To modern diners, the idea of eating rodents often provokes disgust, but within its time, it carried prestige. This pattern repeats across cultures. Foods rejected by some were treasured by others. In the Middle Ages, people often embraced what nature provided with little question. Hedgehogs were baked in clay, their spines pulled off clean when the hardened shell was cracked open. Swans, peacocks, and cranes were roasted for noble tables, sometimes served with their feathers reattached for display. It was not the taste that mattered most, but the spectacle. Dining was an act of theater, and the food chosen reflected wealth and grandeur more than comfort or pleasure. Contrast that with rural households. Peasant meals were shaped by scarcity, where every scrap counted. Weeds that grew in ditches became stews. Bark from trees was ground into flour during famine years. Snails were gathered from fields and boiled in broths. What one group saw as desperation, another saw as resourcefulness. The line between strange and practical blurred constantly. The Viking world gives another glimpse. In the far north, preservation was survival. Fish and meat were dried, smoked, or buried in pits to ferment. Seal blubber was eaten raw. Reindeer milk mixed with blood became a drink. Outsiders might recoil, yet within those harsh climates these foods meant the difference between life and death. It is here you begin to see a recurring truth. What is strange to the outsider is often ordinary to the insider. But strangeness also came from belief. In medieval Europe, powdered unicorn horn, really narwhal tusk, was sprinkled into food or drink as protection against poison. Ground mummy, imported from Egypt, was consumed as medicine. The bones of saints were dipped into wine to bless it. To dismiss these practices as superstition would miss their role. They were ways of grasping at safety in a world filled with danger. Food was never just food. It was shield, remedy, and charm. Asia, too, carried its own set of fascinating traditions. Bird's nest soup, made from the hardened saliva of swiftlets, was believed to promote strength and vitality. It required climbing dangerous cliffs to harvest. Turtle jelly was brewed from shells for its cooling properties. Century eggs, preserved in ash and clay until their yolks turned dark green, became delicacies. Each strange item was framed by an understanding of balance, health, and endurance. The Americas were no less inventive. The Maya consumed cacao not as sweet chocolate but as a bitter, spiced drink, often thickened with cornmeal. It carried divine associations, reserved for rituals and rulers. At the same time, they used insects, frogs, and reptiles as food sources without hesitation. What seems shocking from a modern lens was, in fact, a rational way to thrive in environments where protein came from many sources beyond livestock. And always, famine reshaped diets. In 17th century Europe, when crops failed, people survived by eating cats, dogs, and, in some extreme cases, even leather boiled into soups. During the Great Famine in Ireland, weeds like nettles were harvested for sustenance. In Russia, birch bark was stripped and boiled. These meals were not about taste or tradition, but resilience. To the people who endured them, strangeness had no place. Only survival mattered. When you reflect on these patterns, a deeper question surfaces. Is there truly such a thing as strange food? Or is it simply food framed by circumstance? If hunger drives choice, if belief gives meaning, if culture defines taste, then perhaps strangeness is only in the eye of the beholder. Yet, even knowing this, you cannot help but wonder, if faced with the same circumstances, what would you be willing to eat? When you begin to think about strangeness in food, it becomes clear that what shocks one society often delights another. The boundary between normal and bizarre is not fixed, but shaped by geography, resources, and memory. The foods that seem extraordinary today were often born from deeply practical concerns. Take fermentation. Across cultures, this technique preserved foods long before refrigeration. Yet the results often carried flavors modern palates find overwhelming. Iceland developed hakarl, fermented shark left to rot under gravel and later hung to dry. The ammonia-scented flesh is still consumed in small cubes, washed down with spirits. To visitors, the smell alone feels unbearable, yet to locals, it holds heritage. In Korea, kimchi began as a way to save vegetables for harsh winters, packed into earthen jars to ferment underground. Centuries later, it is a national symbol. Preservation and identity intertwine. The same applies to insects. In pre-Columbian Mexico, chapulines, grasshoppers toasted with garlic, lime, and chili, were abundant and rich in protein. To outsiders, insects often register as pests, but for those cultures, they were an accessible and sustainable resource. Even now, ant larvae, bee brood, and maguey worms are prepared as delicacies. The question is not why these foods were eaten, but why other societies chose to ignore them despite their abundance. Consider also blood. In the past, nothing was wasted. Blood sausages appear across Europe, Africa, and Asia. In Poland, kaszanka mixes blood with buckwheat. In Britain, black pudding blends it with oats. Among the Maasai of East Africa, cow's blood mixed with milk has long been consumed as part of tradition. The idea unsettles many modern diners, but in history, blood was valued for nutrition and symbolic strength. It carried life itself. Even fish skin, bones, and eyes were not discarded. In Japan, fugu, the puffer fish, was a dangerous delicacy. Improperly prepared, it could kill. Yet its risk became part of its allure. The act of eating it was a statement of trust in the chef, of daring in the diner. Across the world, lobster, now considered a luxury, was once so despised that servants in colonial America protested against being fed it more than a few times a week. What begins as disdain can transform into refinement when scarcity and fashion shift. Strangeness also arises from ritual. In medieval Europe, banquet dishes were often gilded with gold leaf, entirely indigestible but glittering with wealth. In China's imperial courts, dishes were sculpted into animals or mythical beasts, sometimes more admired for their artistry than their taste. Food was performance, and performance required surprise. The strangeness was not about necessity, but about awe. Religion, too, shaped diets in curious ways. In Catholic Europe, fasting rules excluded meat on certain days, but fish was permitted. This led to creative interpretations. Beaver tails were classified as fish, allowing them on the table during Lent. Similarly, capybara in South America was given the same classification by church decree, ensuring its acceptance. Strange as it may seem, these redefinitions reveal how faith and survival adapted to each other. Colonial encounters expanded strangeness further. Europeans arriving in the Americas encountered maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and cacao. At first, many distrusted these foods. Tomatoes were thought poisonous. Potatoes were linked to disease. Yet, over time, they became staples. What began as alien transformed into essential. The history of food is full of such reversals, where the line between foreign and familiar is redrawn by necessity, war, or trade. In famine years, desperation pushed boundaries. In 18th century France, accounts describe families boiling grass to survive. During sieges, horses, rats, and zoo animals found their way onto plates. Paris, during the Franco-Prussian War, saw the consumption of elephants from the city zoo. Hunger has a way of erasing categories of strange and normal. Survival demands that everything be considered food. Yet, as you trace these patterns, you notice another theme. Strangeness fades with familiarity. What shocks a traveler on the first day may seem ordinary by the 10th. What disgusts one generation may delight the next. Strangeness is not fixed in the food itself, but in the gaze of the one judging it. So you are left with a question. If today's luxuries were once despised, and yesterday's horrors were once everyday meals, then what foods of today will tomorrow's diners find strange? Will they marvel at your reliance on processed snacks, your affection for sugar, your consumption of coffee shipped across oceans? And if so, what does that say about the fragile boundaries of taste? As you step deeper into the world of food history, the idea of strange begins to dissolve, replaced by an understanding of how survival and ingenuity shaped diets. Strangeness, after all, is simply unfamiliarity wrapped in memory. For every food that seems bizarre to you, there is another culture where it is comfort, ritual, or celebration. Think about milk. For centuries, large parts of Asia avoided it entirely. Most adults were lactose intolerant, unable to digest it without discomfort. Instead, dairy was transformed into yogurt or cheese, easier to consume. In contrast, in Northern Europe, the ability to digest milk into adulthood spread through the population, giving rise to a culture that saw it as wholesome and essential. Something as ordinary as drinking a glass of milk could seem unthinkable to one group and indispensable to another. The very act of drinking fresh milk became, in its way, a cultural peculiarity. Then there is salt. Essential to life, yet precious in many places, salt was stretched as far as possible. In parts of Africa, it was consumed in large crystalline chunks, licked like candy. In ancient Rome, soldiers were sometimes paid in salt rations, from which the word salary emerges. To us, salt is a dusting from a shaker. To them, it was a form of wealth and a tool of empire. A lump of salt carried a value that transcended taste. Spices tell the same story. Today, pepper is so common it barely registers. Yet in medieval Europe it was worth its weight in gold. Cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon traveled along dangerous routes, guarded as treasures. A dish heavily spiced was not necessarily strange, but it was extravagant, declaring the power of the household. At the same time, spices disguised the spoilage of meats or stretched limited flavors in an age without refrigeration. What seems like a strange overuse of spice now was, then, practicality layered with display. And what of drinks? In the Middle Ages, ale was consumed daily by children and adults alike, often safer than water. In parts of Russia, kvass, made from fermented bread, served the same role. In South America, chicha, a fermented corn beverage, was prepared by women who chewed the kernels, using enzymes in their saliva to begin the fermentation process. To some, this may sound unthinkable, but to those societies it was entirely normal, part of daily life and community. The line between sustenance and ritual blurred, and the act of drinking was itself a form of continuity. Eggs, too, carried their own strangeness. In many cultures, nearly every part of the egg was used. In China, century eggs were preserved for months in clay, ash, and salt until the yolk turned green and the white a dark jelly. In Europe, recipes preserved eggs in lime water to keep them edible for winter. In parts of the Philippines, balut, fertilized duck egg eaten with the developing chick inside, remains a street food. To outside eyes, it may appear unusual, but for those who grew up with it, it is heritage. Consider bones. Today, many discard them after meals. But in the past, bones were boiled for hours, sometimes days, to extract every bit of nutrition. Bone broths sustained families, becoming the base for soups and stews. In famine years, bones were reused again and again, yielding a thin, bitter liquid. To modern diners, the practice might feel desperate, but to them it was survival and resourcefulness. Sometimes strangeness came not from what was eaten, but how. In medieval banquets, food was often dyed with bright colors, not for flavor, but spectacle. Peacocks were cooked, then redressed in their feathers to appear whole on the table. Pies might release live birds when cut open, a trick meant to entertain. To your taste, these practices might seem theatrical and wasteful, but they were ways of making meals into performance. Food was art, politics, and theater woven into one. Travelers often marked these contrasts most keenly. When Marco Polo encountered noodles in China, he described them with fascination, though his tales exaggerated their novelty. When Arab traders introduced coffee to Europe, many resisted it, calling it the bitter, black drink. By the 17th century, however, coffee houses spread across cities, reshaping culture. What begins as strange often becomes ordinary once woven into routine. The pattern is clear. Foods begin as curiosities, sometimes despised, sometimes feared. Over time, familiarity breeds acceptance, and acceptance breeds affection. But for every food that becomes loved, there are others that remain forever strange. The question that lingers is this: which of today's foods will be seen as unusual centuries from now? Will future generations recoil at your packaged snacks, your artificial sweeteners, your deep-fried indulgences? Or will they marvel that you considered such abundance normal at all? And perhaps more unsettling, what foods do you dismiss now that might someday be treasured? Could insects once again become common across the globe? Could lab-grown meats, now viewed with skepticism, define the future of dining? What is strange today may yet become tomorrow's tradition. So the thought remains. In every bite you take, in every flavor you savor or reject, you participate in a cycle that has repeated through all of history. You draw a line between familiar and strange, but the line is never permanent. It shifts quietly with time, survival, and memory. When you think about the strangeness of food, it is easy to imagine it as a curiosity confined to the distant past. The truth is more unsettling. Strangeness is alive and thriving, not as an oddity to glance at, but as an ordinary part of lives around the world. Insects are roasted as snacks in Mexico, silkworm pupae are sold from stalls in Korea, and raw fish that would once have turned stomachs is today sushi, elevated to the height of elegance. Strange foods never vanish. They transform, shifting from suspicion to nostalgia, from repulsion to craving. The pattern is ancient. Each society has drawn the line differently. Romans ate dormice stuffed with nuts and honey. Mongols prized fermented mare's milk. The Vikings survived on cod buried underground to rot into surströmming, a fish so pungent that its smell lingers for days. The Aztecs harvested algae from lakes, forming cakes of spirulina that became daily nourishment. Every one of these foods, when lifted from its time and place, feels odd. But within its time, it was nothing more than life continuing as it had to. At the heart of this lies a simple truth. Hunger does not allow luxury. Hunger forces creativity, reshaping what is acceptable. That is why famine years in Ireland drove people to eat grass when potatoes failed. It is why in war-torn Europe, bread was stretched with sawdust, clay, or ground acorns, not for taste, but survival. It is why in medieval villages, soups were kept simmering endlessly, with scraps added day after day until the broth carried the memory of weeks of meals. Strange foods often begin not with desire, but with necessity. Yet survival does not explain it all. Some foods are strange not because of desperation, but because of ritual. In ancient Egypt, priests consumed onions as symbols of eternity. In parts of Polynesia, pufferfish, deadly if prepared incorrectly, became a delicacy of risk and mastery. In medieval Europe, eels were given as tribute to lords, their slippery bodies filling baskets as symbols of wealth. In Japan, blowfish became a challenge for chefs, their ability to prepare it safely a mark of skill and discipline. Strangeness was not merely tolerated, it was celebrated. And you cannot forget the role of performance. Food was a stage upon which power played itself out. Banquets in medieval courts displayed roasted animals sewn back into their skins, their bodies posed as though alive. Brightly dyed sauces proclaimed access to costly imports. In early modern Europe, sugar sculpted into towers and castles sat upon tables, a luxury so rare that its mere presence stunned guests into silence. Here, strangeness was no accident. It was artifice, a declaration of status. The persistence of these foods across centuries also reveals another reality. The human palate is not fixed. It evolves. Tomatoes were once feared in Europe, believed poisonous. Potatoes, too, were resisted, accused of causing disease. Coffee and chocolate arrived as bitter, foreign drinks, and slowly grew beloved. Every food you take for granted now lived through its own season of strangeness. It is only time, repetition, and memory that make it ordinary. This raises a haunting question. Which foods of today, so natural to you, will seem bizarre to those in the future? Packaged chips with fluorescent dust, soft drinks that glow unnaturally in neon colors, meat raised in industrial farms, powders mixed into shakes as meal replacements. All of these may appear to future generations as alien as roasted locusts seem to you. They may look back with the same disbelief, asking how you could have thought such things were suitable for nourishment. And the reverse is equally true. Foods that you dismiss with disgust now may one day be reimagined as treasures. Insects are already returning as a sustainable protein source. Seaweed, once considered little more than coastal debris, is marketed today as a superfood. Lab-grown meat, uncertain in the eyes of many, may become the backbone of future diets. The line between strange and normal is a fragile one, subject to the turning wheel of necessity, culture, and imagination. So, the story of strange foods is not about oddities locked away in distant centuries. It is about you. It is about the way your hunger and memory shape what is acceptable, and the way your descendants will look back on your choices. History is not just written in parchment or stone. It is written in kitchens, in fields, in markets, in the quiet rituals of eating. Each bite carries the weight of centuries, and each rejection carries its own silent judgment. As the story closes, you find yourself lingering on one thought. What defines strangeness is not the food itself, but the eyes that behold it. What is strange is always, in truth, only unfamiliar. And the boundary between strange and normal is shifting even now, silently, across the world's tables. So, you are left with a final question. If someone centuries from now sat at your table, what part of your meal would they find strange? And more unsettling still, if you sat at theirs, what part of their meal would you reject?